We're really thrilled to have such a great panel. First, I'm sure all of you probably know Commissioner Lilian Barrios Paoli. We're really amazed to have her here. She was appointed Commissioner of the New York City Department for the Aging in 2008, following a long career in both city government and the nonprofit sector. Her prior public service includes appointments as a commissioner at several agencies during the Giuliani and Koch administrations, including the New York City Human Resources Administration, the New York City Housing and Preservation Development, and the New York City Department of Personnel. Dr. Ruth Finkelstein is Senior Vice President for Policy and Planning at the New York Academy of Medicine, where she directs policy initiatives to promote healthy aging, improve population health by preventing disease, and reduce health disparities. She has over 30 years of experience in health policy, planning, and research, and currently directs the Age-Friendly New York City Initiative, a joint project with the Mayor's Office and the City Council, and is director of the World Health Organization's Collaborating Center on Aging, Globalization, and Urbanization. Right next to me here is Dr. Dmitry Daniel-Bensky, who is President and CEO of the Russian-speaking Community Council of Manhattan and the Bronx, an educational and charitable interfaith organization of Russian-speaking Americans. He has previously served as a consultant to the Chief Librarian of U.S. Congress and Congressional Research Service, Deputy Director of the Institute of Globalization Studies in Moscow, faculty member at Columbia University, and staff member of Jewish social justice organizations in New York. Irma Rodriguez is Executive Director of Queens Community House, a multi-service settlement house that serves nearly 25,000 children, youth, adults, and older adults at 21 different sites in 11 different neighborhoods throughout Queens. With 30 years of experience in community organizing and social justice work, she has served on numerous boards, including City Project, ANHD, and the Brodnick Foundation for Self-Help Housing. Finally, Kyung Yoon is Executive Director of the Korean American Community Foundation. She's a founding board member of KCF and a longtime community leader and advocate for promoting philanthropy in the Asian American community. Formerly an award-winning correspondent for WNYW, Fox Channel 5 News, she was the first Korean American broadcasting reporter in New York. So thank you all for being here. Let me start, and today we're going to have a very free-flowing discussion. We're going to go right into some questions. I'm going to start by asking questions, but I certainly want to encourage you to chime in. Don't wait. Feel free to jump in and let's make this a great discussion. When we were putting this together, as I mentioned, maybe this is old news to you, but it certainly was surprising to us to just the extent of how large kind of foreign-born senior population has gotten in recent years. I mean, to me, the fact that almost 50% of all of the over 65 population are now foreign-born was just astounding. And I guess I wanted to start, and maybe Commissioner Paoli, how is this playing out in neighborhoods across the city, and what are the implications of this demographic trend on New York?
So we have experienced a tremendous change in our senior centers. In the last, certainly in the 5 years that I've been there, the increase of Asian seniors particularly attending not just certain centers, but most every center. You have an Asian presence now in most every senior center that we have. That has been pretty remarkable. But we've also experienced a tremendous growth in Russians. I would say in people from Southeast Asia, and different kinds of Latinos that we used to have in the past. Not just Dominican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, but also Colombians, Ecuadorians, Bolivians, people from all over South America. Mexicans, certainly. Although the Mexican population tends to be younger, what we see happening is that increasingly older immigrants are coming to join their families. You certainly have a tremendous influx of immigrant younger people, but once they settle in, relatives begin to come, and moms are useful. They can be babysitting the kids, minding the house, doing all those kinds of things. So a lot of the growth in immigrants that we have seen are both in the Asian and Latino population have come to rejoin their families.
Let me skip over Irma. I know we talked, and Christian's data showed that Queens is probably the epicenter. Queens is often the epicenter for trends in immigration in New York, but by far the largest percentage of older immigrants are in Queens. Can you just walk us through how you've seen this change in recent years, and kind of how is this playing out in different neighborhoods across the borough?
Yeah, actually, it was not so much news to us as kind of our daily experience in terms of seeing a lot of older adults from many different countries in the neighborhoods. I think for us, our experience has been largely in, we have 5 senior centers that we operate. 3 are more traditional in the sense that they have congregate meals. And 2 are, one is a clubhouse model that has a special outreach to LGBT elderly, and the second of the 2 non-traditional ones is a kind of peer-led model that focuses on arts and culture. So I just want to say that that's sort of our experience, and they are spread across the borough, 5 centers. And our experience has been that while we definitely are seeing more individuals who are foreign-born in our centers, that the centers kind of have a life of their own, so they started out with a life of their own and people who came, and that the challenge for us as an organization has been in figuring out how to integrate newcomers into the centers, and how to create an atmosphere that was welcoming of lots of different people. And that's way easier said than done. And we could maybe talk about that a little bit more later when we get into solutions, but our experience has definitely been that there's an increasing number of foreign or older adults who need the services that we provide.
Dr. Finkelstein, you probably more than anybody in New York are aware of the trend of the aging of New York's population with the age-friendly task force and so much of the research you've done. Can you tell us a little bit, maybe take the larger picture of what's happening with the demographics in New York? Have you been noticing also this trend of kind of immigrants making up a bigger share of that, and what are the implications for New York going forward?
It is, of course, a trend and a growing trend, but it's not a brand new trend. 10 years ago, we did a study and wrote a paper showing that between 15 and 20% of the older adults in New York City were living without either Medicare or Social Security. So this research shows the increase in that proportion, but that wasn't a trivial proportion. But it was then very difficult to get people to believe it and to pay attention to it. I want to talk for a second about why that is, because that, of course, is not a natural law. That is a policy decision, and as we made that policy decision, so we could make different policy decisions. The reason for that is that you have to work 10 quarters on the books overall in general to receive Social Security, or your legal spouse has to have done so. And there are large communities left out of meeting that requirement. Many of them are in immigrant communities, but there are also other communities left out of that requirement. People who work completely in the informal sector and or who are married to partners who work in the informal sector. And what do we mean, informal sector? Nannies, gardeners, housekeepers, as well just as people who work in retail and the many other service sectors, but not on the books. So I just want to say right now that while this is an increasing trend, it's not a new trend. So what is to be done? First of all, New York needs to continue to be a leader in better giving benefits to people who don't meet the existing federal requirements for benefits. We've done so in other arenas, we need to do so in this arena. We need to continue our progressive leadership in this regard. If not in New York, where? Secondly, we need to make a path to federal benefits, easy, wide, paved path to federal benefits for people who are close to qualifying for them, but not. And third, research has shown consistently, and we saw it just recently in the sort of tabloid-esque headlines in the New York Times. I hated the coverage. But research has shown consistently that families do not have an ironclad, 100% accurate understanding of what everybody's legal status means for everybody's eligibility and immunity from getting in trouble and being deported. And it keeps people from seeking and getting services that they would be eligible for because we have fostered a climate of fear. And so the other thing that we need to do is to foster a climate of acceptance and take away that specter of fear and deportation, which keeps people from coming forward about matters that they absolutely could come forward about. They could apply for food stamps, they could apply for Medicaid, they could apply for SSI, they could report abuse to various places and are afraid to do so because of the environment we house.
Young, I'm curious, as this happens, and if you can speak maybe to the Korean community specifically, what are the biggest challenges that you see older Koreans and older immigrants in general facing here in New York?
Well, as was already pointed out, I mean, Koreans have the highest percentage of limited English proficiency, and so it creates a lot of isolation. And it's interesting, not just for the Korean senior who's here and feeling isolated from the communities at large, but often we've seen within households themselves. Often a grandparent will be brought over to watch over the grandkids, and their children are out, working at often informal sector jobs that have long hours, and sometimes they're getting more sort of Americanized, learning English, and kind of the gap between the grandparent and their own children grows. And then that happens also between the grandchildren and the grandparents. So even within a household, you will see lack of communication, terrific isolation. And for those seniors, they are, really just cut off and very invisible. And often, a lifeline for them can be very, very grassroots kind of senior centers that are in, let's say, neighborhoods of Flushing or maybe pockets in the Bronx or Staten Island. And we find that those senior centers are often, it was cited in the report, they're very small, they lack capacity, they're often run by Korean seniors themselves, who themselves have limited English and don't have connections to sort of other resources. So as a result, what we have found as funders in the community, and we are seeking out to actually go and proactively work with these kinds of senior centers, we see that for the vast majority of them, we are the first source of institutional funding that they have ever received. Whether it's a foundation or government contract, they have never written a grant application before. They don't know, and certainly not in English, which actually we require, because it's sort of that first rung of the ladder. So we do a lot of work, not just in providing funding, which is important, but really in trying to build capacity and to build connections for these centers.
Thank you. Keisha, what about you? What are your observations with the biggest challenges in the older Russian community?
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, our organization doesn't work specifically with the senior population. It's intergenerational, and basically it's a recipient advocacy and community organizing. non-profit that emerged in response to a sense of lack of services for Russian American community in general, particularly in Manhattan and the Bronx where we work. I would like to, in response to this question, to piggyback on something that was said here about the difficulty for people to actually get to qualify for Social Security benefits in their old age. And the one particular reason in our community that I would like to focus on that really is a challenge to Russian American community in general, but hurts elderly over time, particularly so. It is what we see as a huge barriers to equal opportunity for immigrants who come here at a certain age with education and experience and get some more here. People who come here in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. And I think the report talks a little bit about this, saying that they have difficulties having their credentials certified to get employed. In fact, I think the situation is much deeper. We have immigrants here who come here and get American graduate degrees, Ivy League degrees, who have name recognition in their field and who get turned down for employment for years and years before, during, and after the recession. And these are the people who, unfortunately, in our observation, are the most likely to get to their old age worse off than many others in the community, even though based on who they are, they would be kind of, unfortunately speaking, the leaders of the community, the ones who would be the resource for others. And their situation in their working age and in their old age, it is a huge barrier to the community as a whole in general. It is also a huge loss in terms of economic efficiency because such valuable human capital is being wasted. It is a loss to workplace diversity because these people are not in fact being hired in those organizations, in those agencies that are supposed to work with all immigrant population, even specifically with Russian American population. It kind of brings some kind of a bit of cynicism toward education in the younger generation because we see that they're very well educated, sometimes American educated parents are turned down and sometimes literally quote what people hear, why don't you learn to drive a cab? Isn't that what all foreign scholars do here in America? And it spills back into the old country, into the native country, with some kind of things, messages that we don't want to send there. And in a sense, that's kind of the central challenge that our organization sees, and we are very grateful. We greatly appreciate the collaboration of all NU agencies in addressing this challenge for the younger people and for the older ones, because the elders also are looking very often for employment, and they of course have the additional obstacles to the age that is on top of the general sense of lack of equal opportunity for Russians.
Thanks, Irma.
Yeah, I'd like to add a thought about sort of to follow up on the comment around linguistic competency. That part of the dilemma for a lot of organizations is being able to hire that competency and to have it in our organization. We're lucky in that respect at my organization that we have a lot of staff who speak many languages, but I think that some organizations find it difficult to find staff and also don't think about it very much. And not having that competency in-house means that's sort of the first line of not feeling welcome if your language isn't spoken. And it doesn't mean that it has to be only the only one spoken, but that at least somebody is there who sort of speaks it and understands it. And it just made me think a little. My grandmother never learned English. She kind of didn't have to. She lived in a community where she could function pretty well. I mean, I think the stories like this are in the report. She lived with us, with the family. There was English competency within the family, so things could be handled. But less and less older adults are finding themselves in those situations, and I think a lot of it has to do with, and the report speaks to this also, the kind of mobility of the younger people in the household. And they have to follow jobs, And so I really think that something has to happen around language competency within the senior serving network, you know, and probably another piece of the, I'm rambling here a little bit, but I'm getting somewhere. A little piece of it also has to do with social workers and social work schools and the folks who do enter the profession who do have the language competency are often hired elsewhere for a lot more money than organizations like mine can pay. Because they have this extra added skill and ability. And so so it's a little bit of a resource issue around how do you create atmospheres, how do you potentially partner up some of these smaller organizations with maybe larger senior funding organizations in a kind of relationship where they can better serve and better compete for resources.
Can I just follow up on what Irma just pointed? I think that is so critical. I don't know, you know, being an Asian American, and I just see this culture, you know, of, and I think it's not just Asian, you know, many immigrants, you know, they just, you know, sacrifice so much to come to this country. So they, you know, really have this like narrow career, you know, track for their kids that they have to go into, you know, be doctors or lawyers or, you know, or you know, finance people. And that's particularly true in my community. And we don't see parents, you know, thinking broadly about, you know, about encouraging their children to go into fields. And so we see a real resource gap. And so, in fact, my foundation this year, you know, we launched something which is a fellowship, which we actually pay, you know, Korean Americans to be housed at CRE, a community resource exchange, so that they at least can be sort of people who've been like working in, you know, as management consultants, you know, but then decide they want to go into nonprofit but don't really have the nonprofit skills. So we're like, you know, paying for them to get trained. They have to commit to us for 2 years, and we put them into our, you know, to go deep with our grantee partners, like senior centers, you know, which are, and so this has been kind of an innovation for us, just that has come off because we see a real gap here. And so these, and it's absolutely true what Irma says too, that if you are, you know, if you have the language and you've got the, you know, the cultural competency, you wind up going to work for a larger nonprofit, or you don't want to go work, you know, for a small community-based organization that's, you know, serving senior citizens in your community. So this is a real challenge, and it's something that I would love to brainstorm more on.
Let me just throw it out there, particularly to Commissioner Barrios-Paoli and to Ruth. You know, as these demographic changes continue to occur, I think that the things that we're talking about are going to become more and more important for the city and for nonprofit organizations to figure out. It seems like there's two main thrusts here. One is, how do we start planning and enable more of the really great small community-based organizations that have great credibility in their communities? How do we get them to scale up? And secondly, how do we get more of the long-standing organizations that have real expertise in working with older adults to kind of get new abilities, language skills, cultural capabilities, so that they can serve some of these changing populations out there? Any that has to change?
Yeah, I mean, I for two things. One is that there are many large traditional not-for-profits that are already doing it. I mean, you have great examples in self-help in Flushing. It has a completely Asian senior center run by an Asian staff, doing beautifully, serving over 300 people every day. So that's not, you know, that's not unusual. There are others like Hamilton Madison. There are people here who serve Asian populations, but they traditionally serve the Asian population, and so although they're a very old mainstream organization. So that has begun to happen because we require the center to be culturally competent to the population that they're serving. The other piece is that, look, government is not very user-friendly anymore to grassroots small organizations. In order to get a government contract, you have to have a proven track record. You have to have years of experience. You have to, pass the index. You have to have a board that meets the approval of the Mayor's Office of Contracts. There's a lot of impediments for a small grassroots organization to get a contract. The other piece is, for example, when I arrived at the Department of Aging, I almost said another agency. When I arrived at the Department of Aging, we had not RFP senior centers for over 8 years. 9 years, I think it was, and we finally got it together to RFP them, and it was almost 13 years that they hadn't been RFP. So anybody who emerged in 13 years had never had a crack at doing it. In fact, we had, for the first time, there were new providers accepted into the portfolio. But there were a handful, really a handful. And it was very intentional on our part. We really went out of our way to try to get them. And you know, 2 of them at least were serving the Asian population, and there were others who were serving non-traditional populations, you know, visually impaired, the LGBT community. But it was a very intentional thing on the part of TIPTAP, but we still have a handful. So it is problematic, but it's not just the organizations themselves developing capacities, government becoming much more user-friendly in terms of bringing in the smaller organizations and seeing their value.
Before I let Ruth jump in, and I will in just 1 second, to follow up, I mean, as this administration ends, I mean, what would you encourage? Are there any changes that you would suggest for the next administration to change this, to make it easier for small community-based organizations to get involved?
Well, look, having spent a very large part of my life in government, I think I have seen the evolution or devolution maybe towards a really rigid system of contracting. And we don't treat not-for-profits are really the service providing arm of government. Government, by and large, doesn't any longer provide services directly, except in a handful of, smaller areas. Most of the services are done by not-for-profits, and yet we don't treat them as partners. We treat them as vendors, and they're not doing widgets that I'm aware of, right? So, there are partners, and we need to develop a whole new relationship and a different way of codifying that relationship in a contract. I mean, and that's, it is a very difficult system to navigate, both for them and for the government itself. And so that's an area that really needs to be reconsidered. I mean, it has become incredibly difficult and problematic for everyone.
Thank you, Ruth.
And to further complicate matters, I don't think that this is a problem that can be addressed in the traditionally defined aging services sector alone. I think that just as aging itself cannot be moved to the side and treated like a separate problem, issue, deficit successfully, but instead needs to be recognized as a life course issue, right? We start getting old in utero. Literally. The research is clearer and clearer and more persuasive that the seeds of our old age are sown when our seeds are sown, when we, and then that the circumstances of our life is determined all the way along. Just as that is so is it the responsibility of all the facets of society across the life course to deal with, think about, and sort of enhance the asset that are older adults. As I listen to these workforce challenges, these linguistic competency challenges, these cultural competency challenges, it reminds me vividly of the untapped asset that are the older adults that cross these boundaries. And we, just as we have to conceptualize the relationship between nonprofits and government, so do we need to reconceptualize work and what it is to work. And we have to collaboratively make jobs that people at all different stages of their lives can do and want to do, because we need people at all different stages of our lives. Those grandparents, right, that you've got embedded in CRE, which is brilliant, need to be able, and other used to be professionals, need to be able to be working as mentors and trainers and leaders across the spectrum of the city, and they want to be working. And we're not creating those kinds of opportunities because we're caught in old, rigid notions of you're working or you're not working, you're retired or like all of that stuff isn't working for anybody and needs to be reconceptualized, and it adds to the resource base without adding to the sort of public sector expense.
I'm glad you raised the issue of assets as opposed to, we were starting to go down that road of this is a problem, and it's not. And also, I'm glad you raised the issue of a kind of intergenerational approach and a more of a community approach to having people get better integrated and feel more welcome in terms of the whole breadth of their community involvement. And it means that, and I think the report spoke to also the idea of jobs and volunteerism and doing, there are things about the way we've set up the system that really put the programs and services that a lot of us try to provide into these silos. And to being able to cross those silos is hugely difficult. I think Willie would agree that it's not just the procurement policies and the contracting, but it's also the way in which resources come into a community that really divide the way people in the community can begin to address a lot of different issues in their community. So I think that, because Jonathan mentioned that we're multi-service, I think we work very hard as a settlement house to try to connect all of these things. It has become increasingly more difficult as contracts and programs are siloed. But being able to sort of break that apart, and start to look at aging as a community issue that crosses an entire spectrum of folks and that people are valued. I think about the Russian-speaking folks in our community who do come later in life with lots of credentials and find themselves feeling like they don't have any usefulness to this society. It's hugely damaging to them as individuals and as members of the community. The ones who volunteer in our centers and provide some leadership in our community start to build back some of that self-esteem, but it's not easy because the structures that have been set up by our system don't make it easy.
Let me make a comment on that. Because I think Irma is onto something really important. I think categorical funding is the worst thing that ever happened in our service delivery world. I think that I fund for particular things, and God forbid anybody deviates an iota from it. And I think that's the way every funding stream is designed, so that you don't follow need. When I ran a not-for-profit, I used to say we didn't give the people that came to us the services they needed, but the services we had. And the services we had were the services that were funded, whether you needed them or not. And sometimes the needs change and the services continue to be the same because that's what's funded. And I think we need to look at that. That's another humongous, really serious source of why we have the discontinuity that we have in terms of need and services and in terms of ability, things that get funded and things that don't.
Just a couple of words, if you hear me, I don't know whether you're using it. A couple of words to comment on the excellent points that were made here about the thinking differently about employment and volunteering and sort of a broader understanding of those notions. I would say that a great challenge for Russian American community, and I believe for many others, is primarily integration in the full and the deep sense of this term. And employment in the conventional sense is very important, but only one part of this. And for elderly people, it's extremely important to have a sense of being respected and recognized for what they have done, because anyone by that age has done something very important in their life, whether that was a great scientific discovery, just raising a child. And unfortunately, some communities are better at that than others, and it's good that they are better, but we need to bring in those other communities where people have not been recognized properly for what they have done, and there are various ways of doing that. In the Russian American community, we have people, as I said, not only who are very senior scientists and whose works are studied in American colleges, but who also spent decades in concentration camps fighting for the freedom in their country. And those communities, like Russian Americans and some other East European communities as well, who don't have that kind of strong philanthropic sector, that kind of an established way of honoring their people, they need an outside help and support in terms of those people being recognized and put in maybe symbolic but very important positions for the rest of the community, maybe on the boards of their local community centers and non-profit organizations. In the area where I live in North Manhattan, and we also work in the Bronx, we have plenty of those folks. But unfortunately, at this point, they are not on the board. I don't even mention on the staff of any single community organization that works with immigrant populations or a government office elected or administrative. And this is a great resource that doesn't cost really, in the second sense, doesn't cost very little. But it would hugely change the self-perception of the entire community, because these people are seen as its potential leaders.
We ask this to everybody on the panel. With the work that Ruth and the Age-Friendly Task Force are doing, clearly New York has set itself apart as one of the real leaders, not only in the U.S. but internationally in planning for these issues. At the same time, when you think about the scope of the changes that are happening in New York, both the opportunities and the challenges, it does seem like we've only barely scratched the surface. And that, as our report talked about, funding for DFTA is down in recent years. At the national level, funding is down. Funding for senior housing is down. I just want to put out there to everybody on the panel, this is becoming a big issue with these demographic trends, and as the city continues to age. What are the kind of one or two or three biggest things that you think that the next administration are going to have to really wrestle with? What are specific suggestions you have that the city do going forward?
Well, look, undoubtedly that the funding for this has to be increased. It hasn't increased. In fact, it's decreased, as you pointed out. And so that we have more need and fewer services. The other piece is that we have to stop the footballing that happens at budget time between the city council and the mayor, where things are put things are put out there to be killed, and then somebody saves them at the last minute. And in engaging in that pseudo dialogue, what happens is that we don't get more money; we just get saved every time. And so the saving is at a minimum level. So that has to change. You don't put funding for schools to be terminated and fight for them. There are things that we consider to be really important, and so we don't play with them. Youth services and senior services end up being threatened every single year, and that has to change. And that has been happening for a very long time, and we have to look at it differently. They're not ancillary services, they're not nice things we'd like to do, they're important services, they're lifelines for many people. So that perception has to change. The other thing is something that Ruth said earlier. Aging is not a disease. It's not a problem. It's just a natural thing, unfolding of life. And we have to look at it as building supports for people as they age, and try to keep them as healthy and as engaged as possible. And we have to think of, people at 65 when they retire may have 30 years to go. Playing golf for 30 years is kind of a tall order, right? Or fishing or whatever it is. I mean, we have to redefine retirement, we have to redefine how we look at aging. All of these things have to change. And we have to begin to look at life as a continuum, not this sort of like very set stages, and then you become unproductive.
And I think to just expand that into the budgetary realm, it will not be possible to fund aging by funding DFTA. It is only possible to fund aging if we look through the lens of aging at everything we fund. So the city's capital budget must be viewed through the lens of people of all ages. We have to focus on making the roads work, the streets work for pedestrians, for people in chairs, for people on those god-awful skateboards, for people, right, for buses, for paratransit, for taxis and cars. So we have to look at everything we do through everybody's eyes. When we consider how we're gonna do the MTA, we can't have the MTA for this age person, the MTA for this age person, and the MTA for this age person. We have to have public transit that works for the people of the city, the people of the region in point of fact, which means that as we've gone a long way to do, buses have to kneel, they have to get up. Subways, as we change them, have to be accessible. We can't keep building subways that you can't get into and out of. And we have to take that mindset, not just with the physical structure, but also with the service structure. We have to say, food stamps, let's look at that system. Let's recognize the systematic, categorical, ongoing under-enrollment of eligible people in specifically defined populations. Older adults are one, immigrants are another. The intersection is terrible, right? So we have to adapt that system. The way the food stamp system works isn't just right for that population. We can't solve the problem of hunger by feeding people 7 meals a day in senior centers. What are they doing for the remaining, whatever 21 minus 7 is? I bet it's 14. Meals. So that's the other thing I would say. It can't just be increases in the DFTA budget. It has to be reconceptualization in every budget.
So let me add housing to your list, where it can't just be advocating for more 202 housing, because in fact, many older adults choose to live in the community, and what we really need is affordable housing for all, because the housing that's being built and the median incomes of New Yorkers and the incomes that we saw on the screen for older adults don't match up with the housing that's being produced. So I totally agree that looking at it as a lifelong and sort of integrated problem for communities, it's community sustainability that we're really talking about. And older adults are an increasing number in our communities, but they're both a resource and folks who are sort of overlooked in terms of the solutions. And I think that we have to figure out how to do that.
We follow with both of you about that housing, because we've spent a little bit of time in the report on this. But the mayoral candidates certainly have talked a lot about housing, and they say they recognize the need to create new affordable housing. What specifically would you suggest the next mayor do to make sure that the issues that you just brought up are going to get addressed and older adults included?
I really seriously think we have to look at looking at the TANF money that normally funds poverty in the city in a more creative way. And I think we have to look at a housing subsidy for anybody who makes less than, I'm going to say 30,000, I have no idea if that's the right number, but less than X and is working full time or is over a certain age. Because what impoverishes people in the city of New York is housing, to a grand extent. I mean, medical expenses too, but housing is a huge, it's one of the huge factors. The reality is that there are people paying over 50% of their income just for housing. So how about a subsidy for people who make less than X and are working full-time and working poor, or people who are older than a certain age and cannot make a large salary, and that subsidy stays until, you make more money or the end of time. But I think it would be the most constructive way of helping the poor in the city of New York.
I think there are three areas that the next administration can look at. One is, obviously, the previous administrations have looked at housing production as an area of concern, and adding more affordable units to production is one easier way of looking at it. I do believe that developers are already getting plenty of subsidy, and that a little less profit and a little more affordable housing is something that's doable. But the second area is the area of preservation, and that's something that's not really looked at very carefully by the current administration, and that is we're probably losing more units to affordability than anybody is producing, and I think we have to look at ways to preserve current affordable units and to also make them affordable, forever, as opposed to, and there's lots that's been written about that by an organization, the board of which is the Association for Neighborhood Housing Development, material on this. But the third area that people don't talk about too much is NYCHA, frankly, and it's a huge resource for low-income people. It's underfunded, it's been run, there's a lot of things going on. And I think if the next administration, and there's a lot of empty apartments. So, and a lot of people on the waiting list. So I think if the next administration could put some effort, time, and thought into how to fix that system, it's a huge resource for the city of New York, and we're just sort of letting it lie there,
What about, one of the things that came out in our report also is the kind of, obviously, we've kept hearing again and again how people, want to live close to their families. They don't want to go to nursing homes. They don't want to go part, as you were saying, and there's so many, there's a tradition of extended families in a number of immigrant communities. But yet, the kind of housing that we have in New York, or the housing that's being developed, doesn't always fit with those kind of changing needs. For instance, good luck trying to find a 3-bedroom apartment in New York City. There's a lot of issues that have come up very recently around illegal basements that might be workable. But Kyung, do you have any thoughts on just kind of like the housing when it comes to just multi-generational families and just thinking differently about this?
Oh, that's a huge, huge issue. And I think that, we are just at a place when I see, where people just are, their expectations are very low. That they expect to be living in very, very cramped kind of housing. And, but one of the things that as seniors have become, have had some doors open to senior housing and to low-income housing. Something that I'm seeing is actually the opposite, which is, for example, in the Bronx, which has more affordable housing for seniors. We're seeing in the Korean community, absolutely just Korean seniors in the Bronx with no infrastructure around them. It's not like Flushing, where they actually have some Korean restaurants or they're just there in senior housing all alone and without anywhere to go. And so that's why we actually fund the only Korean Bronx senior center. And and with our funding, they started a lunch program with Korean food, because as we all know, food is so important, and so, it gives the seniors a place to go, and they have not just the food, but the fellowship and the kind of, even though it's not a lot of programs. So it just becomes so important as a lifeline, for them. But I just want to just say one thing too. As we're talking about different cuts and about, just that's not the solution. And I don't want to, I do see, incredible need for more private-public partnerships. We talk about seniors being a resource or an asset, right? I think we need to think about immigrants as assets to New York as well. And in a small way, my community, our foundation is just a little over 10 years old. We started with this idea that there are charitable Koreans, but they're giving kind of to churches, and I mean, it's all good, but it's very random charity. But what if we started a community foundation where we can move funds together and do significant investments and really, get these organizations that are off the radar, not get, Asians are now 13% of New York City. We get less than half of 1% of foundation funding, half of 1% of government contracts. So, we also, I'm one of the founders. In 2003, which is our first year of funding, we cobbled together just with an idea, just asking our Korean American friends, who were kind of successful. We raised $60,000 that year, and I remember we gave it out to 5 community-based organizations. And we're really proud of serving vulnerable populations. So not just seniors, but we fund vulnerable populations. This year, we just passed $3.2 million in grant making. And so I know that compared to, maybe big established foundations or government, that's maybe a drop in the bucket. It's significant for us. And so maybe that is another way to kind of start thinking about, creatively about getting immigrant communities, organized around philanthropy and giving together.
I want to just jump back for 1 second to a very specific housing issue related to community. And this, again, is a policy intervention that can be made, which is that the lottery for federal subsidized housing, the 202 housing, works irrespective of neighborhood. So this is how come you have isolated Koreans in the Bronx. This is why we found in our work in East Harlem a group of monolingual Chinese speakers in East Harlem. You think East Harlem, that's not what you're thinking about, right? And they were absolutely isolated. This scattershot approach, where people get moved from their communities, our research shows clearly that if you're in a community that supports you, your cultural background is not an impediment necessarily and can in fact be an asset. But if you're isolated and culturally and linguistically isolated, it's a huge impediment. And it's an example of the way that housing can't be thought of as separate from community. It's true across the age span, but it is most particularly true for older adults who are known to spend more time in their immediate neighborhood, and therefore where they live is more central to the quality of life.
Luigi, what's your recommendation for the next administration? Maybe it's to tap the kind of opportunity that you talk about getting people more engaged in the workforce, people with the skills that they could really contribute to New York. It could be something else. What's your specific recommendation that you'd like to see?
It's everything that you mentioned and other mentioned, so I almost don't have to respond for it. But I wanted to say a couple of things that come from what was just said, very important things on housing, for example. The community needs, the needs of different immigrant communities are different, and you really need to research them and have people who know them and who study them. And there is, unfortunately, one of the major themes of this campaign, as far as I understand, following it as much as I should, has been the theme of inequality. And I think there is some degree of inequality, of course, not just between immigrants and the rest of the population, but also across communities that could be somehow addressed. In this regard, I must say that for a any Russian-American community organizer, it's an exceptional occasion to be a part of this discussion, and I greatly commend the Center for actually walking the walk of diversity and inclusion with regard to Russian-Americans. For example, in our community, we have small families, generally speaking. We have what is called a high number of household per capita. And one of the major issues for elderly Russian Americans is home care and differences in access to home care. In a sense, the group that was mentioned here before, those that get great difficulty in qualifying through the sufficient amount of work for Social Security. They are in the most disadvantaged situation in their elder age in terms of access to home care need, and given small families and given that children very often have to work far away. Sometimes I know people who work on other coast from their 90-year-old parents. It's a very big issue. And one last point, I think that was, I'm thinking what was not mentioned here because almost everything was. But I think at least one thing that maybe I can maybe phrase differently is the need for representation of immigrant communities in the process of decision making. I think more substantially more than it was from my observation in the present administration, not just in offices like Office for Mayor's Office for Immigrant Affairs, but in all of the government agencies. I think one interesting experiment in the city has been, in some parts, so-called participatory budgeting. And I think at least some elements of this would be very essential for immigrant communities to get their message across to the
Dimitri, one of the things you mentioned that's I think interesting is that in this mayoral campaign, we certainly have heard a lot about kind of the wide divide in the city. Some say tale of two cities. But clearly, when you see, as Christian's numbers put it out, 130,000 or so older immigrant adults that are in poverty in New York, it really makes you wake up and see, although we certainly have talked about the opportunity here, that is a big challenge for New York. And as the number of older immigrants continue to rise in the years ahead, I think this is something that policymakers are going to have to look to address. And it certainly, as panelists have said, goes beyond DFTA to solve. But what are some specific things that you'd like to see different city agencies take on? We've talked a little bit about the housing issues, but beyond housing, beyond kind of the budgetary issues that DFTA is facing, what could be done from a policy level to kind of get at the kind of rising levels of poverty among older immigrants? What could be done to get at the language barrier that seems like it's so connected to the high levels of poverty? What are your specific suggestions?
Well, yeah, of course, it's easier to say that they need more funding for all those programs. It's kind of evident, but also I think can't be very optimistic about that. At least it seems to me. I think things that were mentioned here in terms of thinking differently about employment and volunteer opportunity for older people, including with government agencies. More integration, inclusion in the debate and in the in the discussions that are involved in the decision-making process. And yes, of course, also I think some dialogue, direct dialogue, maybe with the philanthropic world and the people who generally have the capacity in the community to improve its lot, because there are some communities that also have very high level of internal inequality, including actually Russian Americans. Again, representation in this kind of discussions to begin with is extremely important for a community like ours, which is the third largest in New York with over 200,000 people.
Yeah, I think Ruth had a very important point. I think we have to look across the board and look at the different subsidies and services and see how seniors fit in that. I think that the tendency has been to think that because of Social Security and Medicare, seniors are taken care of. And the reality is that in a city like New York, a lot of people who are really poor are living on Social Security and Medicare and find it extremely, extremely difficult to do. It's food stamps and it's some sort of a housing subsidy. We have SCREE, it's underutilized. We have the food stamps indeed are underutilized. But I think we have to look at the spectrum and see how seniors can get included into those kinds of services. I think a voice is really important. I think one of the things that happens as you become older is that you become invisible. And so my father used to say that now he had all the answers, but nobody asked him any questions. And the older you are, the less regarded you are. I mean, I find myself, and I find my staff, even though I am an older New Yorker and an immigrant, I find that we tend to think for the seniors, and we tend to sort of give them the services we think they need. And rarely do we go to the seniors and say, well, what do you think you want? So a voice is really important. I think part of feeling part of the community is being heard and being accepted and being listened to, and that doesn't happen.
Just to follow up quickly, and maybe this is being done because I know the age-friendly task force has got this, and as Ruth was saying, it was really, I think the report was really about how do we get all city agencies to doing these things. But I'm curious, we've done some research recently about the Center for Economic Opportunity, and one of the things that's, I think, really important about what CEO has done in New York is that it was a mayoral agency that brought all of these different agencies in city government to kind of attack poverty. And I think that having that mayoral location to do that was very important to get everybody to do something about this. And I'm curious, and maybe that's a role DIFTA tried to play, but I'm curious in the next administration, given these demographic trends and given the enormity of some of the challenges, is it worthwhile to have some kind of function in the mayor's office that can help various agencies from planning to housing to everyone else to be doing something to plan for the aging of the population?
Yes, but I hate the degree of specialization where you're going to have a deputy mayor for aging, a deputy mayor for children, a deputy mayor for every activity that we think is important. I think we have to go back and look at services differently, and each agency has to be responsible for looking at the whole continuum. So, aging is very specialized, but the reality is that we have a section of DIFTA that deals with grandparents for parenting, and they have children, and we have to deal with the kids. We have foster grandparents, so life is not so segregated itself. Our services are the ones that are. So we have to think of continuum, and we have to, I think that's a role of a deputy mayor for human services, to begin to say, well, how does aging interface in all of this? How is poverty in everybody's life? Those kinds of things. But I think when you, again, segregate the role, it's a problem. I think with CEO, I love CEO, I think it's a wonderful thing. How do we translate the pictures of CEO into the mainstream services of every agency, as opposed to having it be wonderful by itself? It has to become part of the mainstream.
Which was actually the theory of Age Friendly New York. Age Friendly New York is a partnership between all those government agencies and the not-for-profit sector and the business community and the philanthropic and the academic sectors, which is actually what I think you need, even though it's kind of a mess. It's hard to make it work on a daily basis. It's hard to do the executive, legislative, free on crosswalk on a daily basis. But I think that these sort of cross-societal opportunities and challenges require these cross-societal coordinated, it's a different model of governance. And I think that the different model of governance is necessary to solve most of the sort of pernicious problems before us and to get us to take advantage of most of these opportunities. I want to just call out in terms of, I think you asked earlier on, how can we do this in this environment of shrinking resources and so on. I really do believe that the employment piece, the educational piece, and the change in the benefits, the policy changes in benefits that allow people to be able to work more without sacrificing government benefits is going to be critical. We're thinking in an old, outmoded way, and we're not going to be able to raise the service dollars to I know I sound like a neoliberal apologist, and I apologize. But we are going to have to change that benefit structure so that it's available for people who have to have it So it's going to have to be able to fill in around people that are generating some income, rather than having it be a black, white, on, off dichotomous process.
So I'm gonna speak like the agency exec at the ground level in a sense, because it's sort of, I think coordination is wonderful. I think advocacy for policy change is wonderful. It all takes time. Coordination of services is a messy deal. But meanwhile, on the ground in the community, resources are not enough. More resources. So I just want to get out here that I'd love to see just get more money. I'd love to see more money put into community services. The bottom line is it's very hard to do anything without it. We try, but it's hard. And I also feel that the solutions, if there are problems that need to be solved, are really at the community level. And I think that everything that's been said about voice, about coordination, about all, working together better, really plays out at the community level. And until I hope that the next administration sees that and recognizes it and values it. I don't think it was terribly valued for the last few years, and I think it's important to work at the neighborhood level. New York City is not a city. It is a collection of communities. And no more so than in Queens, where everybody hangs on to the community name so hard that they drive the post office insane. So, I think what we have to do is recognize that that's the case. It's not that every community is so unique and can't be, combined with others. They're not, but they feel it. And I think that's where people have to be involved and where the real solutions lies at the community level. And I hope that there's some respect for that going forward. And some flexibility. I think this whole conversation we've been having about how hard it is to use the resources we have, because of the inflexibility of the contracting process is just hugely important.
We're going to open it up to questions from the audience, but I'm going to ask one last question, particularly for Irma and Jung, and that is just to get at Irma's point. If the next administration were to kind of really see community-based organizations as real assets, in particular to solve the kind of aging immigrants, not the problem, but all of the issues that we're confronting as a city. What other things, if any, would you suggest that we start to think about to empower your organizations? What needs to happen specifically?
It's, as we all know, it's very challenging because we talk about communities and we talk about immigrants, and it's just such a catch-all, right, for so many languages, so many cultures, and I totally understand why it's really difficult for sometimes government and foundations or who are operating at this level, to totally be missing significant activities and great things that's happening down here. I mean, it is that I am seeing so many organizations that are absolutely off the radar, that are falling through the cracks because they are not on the radar of the mayor's office or Ford Foundation. And so this, I think we need to be. And I know that there are efforts, but we need, especially in immigrant culture, for me too, being an immigrant. I came to America when I was 6 years old, and speaking English really well, and being on television, and a lot of Koreans saw me as a bridge, right? They saw me as a voice. I was like, visible. And for the first time, they saw a Korean American on television, on a regular news channel. That was kind of huge, right? Because it represented something that, somebody with, that it gave hope and empowerment. So I feel like there is, for many of us in that bridge generation, that we can play that role, and I think just organizationally maybe we can be beefing up that bridge. And so maybe it's an impossibility for, to be like really getting down to the grassroots, but maybe doing more investments around sort of like, like the kind of effort that we're making by organizing ourselves as a community foundation and paying attention and having our ear to the ground, but also being on a panel like this and being able to make those connections.
Sure. Yeah, I think probably one thing that I would like to add to the long list of integration is more emphasis, much more emphasis on integration and much more significant, in every sense, agency that to deal with that. And one example or one sort of related point to that is that I think we shouldn't think about the city separate from what's going on at the federal level. At the federal level, we of course have the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill, which usually is mentioned only with regard to the undocumented population, which is of course very important. But it also has very, very significant detailed provisions for new integration agencies, including some pilot immigrant councils with quite significant powers at the local level. I think that not only it's very worthwhile to advocate for this as legislation, but also maybe start doing something along those lines in New York City.
Great. Questions from the audience?
Hi, I'm Nancy Miller. I'm the CEO of Vision Services of the Blind and Visually Impaired. And we have a very diverse workforce working with people with vision loss and multiple disabilities. What about suggestions of government that just as for-profit companies can get tax credits for hiring certain underemployed populations, to have incentives for nonprofits who can't take a tax credit when we hire, as I just did, a senior who is blind and deaf and from a community of color. So we don't have access to some of the tax incentives through tax code that businesses have, and yet we are one of the largest employers in New York City. So looking at the role that the government agencies that serve immigrant and elder populations, looking to the new administration to build in incentives so each time I hire an underserved population as a nonprofit, that we too would get some incentive to encourage us to do so.
All right. All right, thank you. Next question. Right here.
We've been talking a lot, and I know that's what the forum is about institutional and policy changes. But I was wondering how much of the challenge to tapping the resources of older adults and tapping them as volunteers and bringing them into the centers has to do with gender and cultural influences within the communities themselves. People who say, we brought over grandma to take care of the kids, so she belongs in the house and she shouldn't be out schmoozing or volunteering or playing mahjong or whatever. How much of that prevents older women from joining the greater community, and what can we do about it?
You know, our senior centers have a lot of older Asian, Latino, and other cultural groups, and mostly women, by and large. I mean, the most difficult thing in the senior center is to attract the men, unless you have a pool table or some such activity. I don't think it's to the coming of the center or participating in those activities. I think the bigger barrier is joining the workforce. And I think that that's not just cultural, but it has to do with language and skills and a bunch of other things. We have tried, we have a program that is funded through Title V of the federal government. And it's been cut every which way to Sunday, let me just add, but we've been trying to identify people who need extra quarters to be eligible for Social Security and put them to work in such a way so that they can become eligible. And it's been, it's modest, but it's been successful. And I think we need to have more of those programs so that we identify somebody who was attached to the workforce at some point and with a modest amount of investment can be eligible for the things that you need to qualify. I think the issue of culture is really very interesting, because the older, it's not so much that you come from a traditional culture. The older you become, the more attached to the culture of origin you become, And so that it's, I don't, you know, it's sort of I guess a logical thing that it's a comfort thing. And so you in that sense tend to prefer to go to where you feel more comfortable. And I think that is true. You know, so you find that in senior centers, people cluster by culture. And they want to have their food, and they want to have their own friends, and you know, the reason that we did a center for the visually impaired and the LGBT community was respecting those feelings. That, you know, after a certain age, you're used, you know, you don't want to deal with all those efforts of merging into everybody else's culture. But you know, it's comforting, but it also becomes a barrier to your greater integration into society. So, you know, that's the challenge in New York. That's a big challenge in New York.
And that's a challenge that we've tried to take on a little bit in terms of if you see everybody in the community as potentially a leader and somebody who can add, then they need to be comfortable outside of their comfort zone. And so the thing becomes, I know I had a conversation with Christian about it on the phone, which was how do you take a senior center that may have traditionally belonged to one group, you know, and create an atmosphere in which a lot of different people can feel comfortable. And I think it's a conscious effort, you know. You can't just say we're open to all, we're friendly people, and everybody should come. It doesn't work that way. And so, you know, being able to, you know, people sometimes walk through one of our centers, our site in Forest Hills, and they go, wow, you know, it looks like you guys, you know, have lots of different people in here. How do you deal with things like holidays and stuff like that? You probably are very careful. And I say, yeah, we're careful to celebrate everything, you know, and so, and we, you know, to show respect for everything, so that we have this senior center, you know, that has Asian and Latino and Russian speaking and South Asian members all in the one room having lunch. Some of them may still be sitting at their own tables, you know, agreed that it hasn't gotten that far yet, you know, but the Russian speaking members of the center come out for the Tai Chi classes and the sword dancing, and different people start to do different activities. And what that means in terms of their being able to connect to others who they might have seen very much as the other, is that they can then go out into the community and connect to others, you know, and to be leaders in their community. So I think it's hugely important for us to think about that in terms of how our senior centers look. And I'm not saying that it's not important to have a Korean only or Latino only, but that the system also has to be open to, we can serve a lot more people if everybody starts to look at their center as a place that the community as a whole can use, you know, and that lots of different people can come in and feel comfortable. It's not an easy thing to do, and I know that our staff at our more traditional senior centers really think consciously about how to integrate folks differently. And a lot of it is the linguistic stuff, and a lot of it is the cultural stuff, but also it's about making people feel like members of the broader community.
Great. Just to add quickly, one very small part of our report, we talk about some of the challenges facing Middle Eastern women. Many of them have been comfortable going to kind of traditional or groups that maybe were apart from their own community, and we interviewed a couple people. I think it was a Pakistani women's organization. Am I right with that?
The General Muslim Serving Organization.
Yeah. So there are some of those issues clearly that come up. But we got a lot more questions right here.
Joe Durack and I work with the ARP Foundation, and we run a program and provide services to the community. And I want to quote Leanne for the excellent discussion here, because I think what I'm hearing kind of as a theme, though, is the need for a holistic approach and a collaboration to solve the problems. Holistic in the sense that we have problems that it's not one individual problem, necessarily employment, but when you start to peel back the onion, you find out there's isolation issues, housing issues, and others. And one that, you know, an example where we have worked with senior centers, they're not just places like Bengal or Pool, but they're also, we've worked with collaboration. So you'll have Title V or Senior Community Service Employment workers there teaching computer skills, which technology, I've heard, you know, generation gap and technology gap sometimes are pretty great. And so we can bring things together to work together in a senior center where people congregate. Those naturally occurring communities for older people is where the solutions seem to lie. So I was wondering from the panel, is there any way that we can, at this level, and given the not so optimistic outlook for funding, how we can collaborate and bring these groups together to kind of, if you would, integrate services and then also look at working together in a collaborative way to solve some of these problems?
Yes, of course. I mean, I think that part of what we have to do is really use resources that are already there, and you can leverage them by bringing them together. And of course, our centers are, I think they're all open to all kinds of collaborations, and they do. So I think anyone would welcome, an approach, and I'd be happy to facilitate.
Anybody else on that question? Or?
My name is Howard Schlesinger. My cousin just started a 501c3 to help challenged children after school. And there's a real dearth of after-school programs for challenged children. And in the continuum of life that you're talking about, that it is just what we do as aging people, starting from the very beginning, as you so eloquently stated, that we need purpose throughout our lives. And I'm wondering, in this following of what you're saying here of collaboration, if there's some tool or some way that we can connect the senior population who are looking for purpose in their communities to reach out to a population that has tremendous needs of guidance and help. And there's this growth of that industry because in our generation now we're seeing that people are recognizing that there are challenged children that need help. It didn't happen when I was growing up. We didn't recognize they were challenged children. Now we're recognizing it, and services are just starting to show up. And the idea of having purpose for seniors to help these children would be terrific. And if there were communication tools put together, because all your organizations in the various communities, I think could do that.
There are a number of programs that do that precisely. We have the foster grandparents that go into all kinds of schools and help children with homework, reading, whatever. There's a very, very productive program that is about a year old, putting seniors with teenagers at risk of dropping out, and has been incredibly successful. I mean, that's one of the sort of best kept secrets. Seniors from the community really mentoring young people that are really about to drop out or dropped out already from high school. There's also the RSVP program run by Community Service Society that is very good. There are a number of programs.
And there are a number of structures that each of which could be expanded and better publicized. And I think, expanded. So time banking is another one to mention, which is the wonderful idea, and it exists. Time bank exists in New York City, where you put in hours in providing one kind of service, and you're then banking hours to receive another kind of service. You could really see that kind of reciprocity being very generative there. And then just to mention the experienced core idea, which I know that ARP is actually involved with, where you're, in a structured way, linking older people and kids at risk in the school day, and the idea of expanding that into after school, which is such a gigantic, everybody recognizes it, need in New York City, seems like an agenda for another mayor, right?
All right, let's take one from back there in the corner there, and then right back here next.
Hi, thank you all for speaking. My question is, we talked a lot about workforce development and technology and all of those community needs, and I wanted to know what you think about public libraries and their potential for serving communities. Lots of seniors and immigrants are already comfortable going to public libraries, and they're addressing a lot of these needs. And so I wanted to know, what do you think about the potential of public libraries for the expansion of services?
We do have a very strong relationship both with the New York Public Library and the Public Library in Queens. And we do a lot of programming with them. And in fact, we just met about a week ago in order to strengthen the programs more at the neighborhood level, pairing them with senior centers. And we've had several sort of meet and greet between the heads of senior centers and the heads of libraries. So it is a huge tap, it's tap, but it could be enhanced kind of resource.
I think collaboration between organizations kind of has to be in the organization's DNA a little bit, because some do it better than others. I mean, I think we like to collaborate with a lot of other organizations. It means we collaborate quite a bit with the Queen's Library, with many of our different programs. But I think there's no, I think it helps for there to be some kind of a structure or a kind of, yeah, some form of matchmaking kind of entity, that will also address some of the things you were saying, which is, there's a lot of resources out there, a lot of organizations can tap into each other's and can be better together in lots of ways. I'm not talking about mergers, but, really collaborating programmatically. It doesn't happen as much as it could, and I think it should happen.
Just to put in a plug, if you didn't know this already, we published a report earlier this year called Branches of Opportunity, which is all about the real kind of increasingly important role of public libraries in serving immigrants and serving older adults and a lot of other New Yorkers as well. Yes. You go ahead and introduce. Please go ahead.
I have a question.
There is unfortunately a disconnect between them and small immigrant-based cultural groups that and even sort of language-based the culture-specific bookstores where people of at least in our community get together for book discussions in their own language, but at least they have, in my experience, are fluent in English. And the public library doesn't know or whatever about them, or is not aware, even though they're almost next door. I think there should be more relationship with those groups and their integration, some kind of welcoming that is often, sometimes we often use the sentence of welcoming a stranger. I think that's precisely those strangers that would benefit the libraries if they welcome.
I'm wondering, from looking from the outside in, there's a perception, I would argue, ad hominem, that the immigrant seniors are more likely to inhabit intergenerational households. And is that true? And secondly, I haven't read the study completely, and to what extent are they legal? And to what extent are they living in households with invisible incomes? And to what extent does this whole problem just reveal the greater problem of immigrants in general and their lack of, to what extent is their plight symptomatic of a larger immigrant problem of future that we can all look at in the future of lack of resources and lack of integration. So I'm just wondering, is it true fundamentally if immigrant seniors are more likely to live in intergenerational households than indigenous? My guess is that they would be, but I'm wondering if that doesn't cut to the chase of this, that somehow they're part of a family unit that is missing in so much of society.
Kristen, because your findings are different than mine, so do yours.
Well, and it's you get into the question of there's a lot of seniors who live in intergenerational households, and that is true for many of them. Although that differs significantly from different country of origin groups. And so, for instance, I mean, it's like I think Dmitry, you were speaking that in the Russian population, there's a lot of seniors living alone or with spouse, which accounts for what you see. There's a lot of Russian households that are linguistically isolated because it's just them and their monolingual Russian speaking. This is different for some of the newer groups as well, where they brought in their grandparents to take care of children and they're living in a multi-generational household. So really, I mean, it's like the issue really differs from different groups. Another major issue that affects, I mean, it's like how well different immigrants do in the United States is how long they've been here. Again, I mean, it's like, some of the groups that arrived when they were in their 20s have probably worked here all their lives, have integrated a lot more. I mean, it's as Ruth was saying, and are more likely to do well when they're older. However, I mean, to bring up the example again of the Russian population, the average age at which a Russian immigrant that is currently over the age of 65, the average age at which they arrived in this country was 52. So, I mean, it's like when we get into the idea of have they worked here for 10 years, have they been able to assimilate enough into American society to be able to speak the language better, chances are the answer is no in that case. So really the answer very much differs depending on the country of origin.
And just big picture, older adults are most likely to live alone. That's true in the immigrant communities overall. More so than you would imagine, right? You have an intuition that that's not so, but remember the extent to which their kids are pressed out of the city, and so they're often in the surrounding area, but not in New York, so that a very common pattern is that the immigrant generation is left in the old neighborhood alone, and the next generation is further out where education and housing affordability is within some spectrum of reach. There's some greater intergenerational living in a couple of cultural groups, but then remember, we're only talking about those people who are documented and living in those places that are legally registered. So you've got anecdotally quite a different picture out of specific neighborhoods.
So the bottom line is it's not really true. It would be
it is, I think, more a perception in New York than it is reality.
All right, we've got three more here. 1, 2, and 3.
First of all, Harvey Morado from the Silverman School of Social Work at Hunter College. I want to thank the panel for addressing some serious issues. As we look at the effects of cumulative disadvantage and the high cost that results in the aging population, is certainly significant. So it's refreshing to hear at least speak to this life course perspective. My question is a bit different than what we've been speaking to. As we look at funders from the federal government to our local foundations, making this what I call serious push to evidence-based models of practice and program delivery. I wonder what unique challenges the panel might see as we look at a culturally diverse population that does not necessarily respond to, if you will, these routinized evidence-based models that we're being forced to look at. Parallel to that, we're also looking at the Medicaid redesign of participant-directed and consumer-directed care, kind of running counterintuitive to these evidence-based models. I think the challenges are really significant. So it might be beyond the scope of the panel, but if someone could address that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, one of the things that we have found is that when we tell the providers that they have to use evidence-based models, when you go back and look at the evidence-based models, you find local adaptations to the evidence-based models, because the evidence-based was collected in Michigan in an all-white population of Norwegian descent. Right, and then you come and you're having this in the South Bronx, and in a very different kind of situation with Latino participants, or in Flushing with Asians. And so the providers in their very adaptable way, they adapted the evidence-based model and made it evidence-based with a little e as opposed to the big E. And so one of the things that we want to do, and we've begun to do, is to look at what are these local adaptations of evidence-based and how do they work, and are they, clearly they work better for our population because that's why people are doing it. But, can we demonstrate something? For the larger community about what happens when you have an evidence-based model with a particular cultural group. I mean, it's not a uniform universe that we're dealing with, and how do you work with that?
One of the interesting issues, though, when you start talking about the libraries, how many of them are accessible? How many valid polling sites? How accessible really are senior centers? It is, and I love the fact I go to Oxford, Washington for a meeting. I can't use their bloody bathroom. That's a new center relatively. I mean, this is ridiculous. There are federal, state, and city laws that have been just totally ignored by aging services.
It's a different population for those of us who are disabled and age, and those who age and become disabled. But the reality is, eventually, everyone's going to be in my shoes. But the fact of the matter is, you can't do all those things you're talking about. You know, transportation, forget it. I mean, the MTA and New York City Transit, rather, just got rid of return slips. Didn't talk to you guys, didn't talk to us guys, just got rid of them. And they're using Metro-Plus. For the average senior, that's a very different way of functioning from what they may have been doing for the last 50 years. So it's an interesting fact that when you talk about the city working together, it's not. And we're not working, I mean, DIFTA and Moped, other than the smart card, have they ever done anything together?
We do, but let me say this, you're absolutely right. Not just accessibility, which is a main issue. Most of the facilities that the centers are located in are really not good. No, without a question. I mean, even the better ones leave something to be desired. So and there has to be a huge amount of capital investment in making just a place where the senior activities are done, accessible, friendlier for the seniors, all kinds of things. You're 100% right. It is not, the physical locations are really not very good at all, without a question. In terms of, we work with Moped. Moped is awfully under-resourced as we are.
With 7 people?
They're lovely. I mean, they're wonderful. But if they can only do what they can do because there are only 7 people. And, so we do things with them, but their repertoire is by necessity much smaller than it could be. But you're right.
It's a great question. We're going to try to get 2 more questions. I do want to say quickly, one of the really interesting things in the report is that it's not just the kind of accessibility issues for older adults. I think there are some unique issues around older immigrant adults. For instance, everybody thinks about the 7 train as kind of the International Express or whatever. How many of the 7 train stations are accessible? Very few of them. There's a lot of accessible stations in New York City, but how many serving immigrant neighborhoods are accessible? And I think that's one of the things we might have to confront.
That's the issue. There really aren't a lot.
They're not a lot. That's my point.
Thank you. Arlene Blatt, Market Research and Strategy Consultant. I want to begin by thanking the Center for the Future and all of the panelists today for an outstanding discussion. We heard a lot of very important things. I want to highlight the concept of age-friendly New York, which I think is outstanding, as well as Ruth's comments about that the solution for seniors is not seeing things through the lens of seniors, but through the lens of all age. To that point, this conversation today, I think we've been preaching to the converted. My question is, what are we doing? Is the Center for an Urban Future and this panel going to go out and speak to the public, going out to elementary schools to let children know that curb cuts are not just for wheelchairs, but are good for their skateboards, for high schoolers to know that time banks can help them fulfill their volunteer responsibilities. You know the rest of the way that you can convince the rest of the population of the value of age-friendly New York. Could you talk about how you're going to go out about and accomplish that goal?
I am not feeling on the spot at all. I'm gonna learn to tweet. This year, I'm gonna learn to tweet. I mean, I think, in some seriousness, I think that part of what we have to do is to recognize that we have to communicate in these very different ways to very different parts of our constituency. And I think that the good part about that is it's skill it's skill and a kind of resource, but it's not money. Because until very recently, sort of mass communications meant mass dollars. And so we're losing our excuse about why we can't enter the public discourse with different messages. And we're working very aggressively to learn to do that and try to do that. And if I was really good, I would say, and follow us on age-friendly, whatever, but I'm not yet hashtag smash tag, but, because I'm not quite there yet. But I'm, it's actually a serious thing that we've got on the one hand a population that still says that they get their information from bulletin boards, community bulletin boards, though of course everybody knows the fastest growing population on the internet is older adults, but still most common bulletin boards. Two, email is so yesterday. It's like, I can't reach my staff by email anymore. I have to, only text and only IM and only post it on their Facebook goddamn wall, which I think is ridiculous. Inappropriate.
Can I add one thing there? And I think for immigrant populations, what's really, what I've noticed that's really very efficient though is ethnic media.
Yes.
I just find that penetration is like so high in the Korean community. If you hit like 2 major newspapers, you can really reach people in a targeted way, and I think certainly in the Chinese and in other Asian and Russian communities. So I do feel like that is one area, and it's kind of not about social media, but really about good old newspapers and television
And
radio.
I think she had one quick comment, and then you can go.
Well, I'll speak very loudly. I just want to make sure we include the business community in this discussion. Age-friendly New York means hiring older workers, and we have a new program for seniors over 50 professionals that we're putting back to work, and I just want to make sure that we include the business community in this discussion.
First of all, in the spirit of collaboration and partnership, I'm very happy to have the Twitter. We have 1,400 followers and invite everyone who wants to follow us at Roost Manhattan. That's one thing, and basically I think something that was already mentioned here. Yes, of course, the media, print media, are very important. Unfortunately, there's very little communication, very little dialogue between, at least in our community, and I know in others, different ethnic media in their language and English language media. And I think there should be much more sort of assistance in getting the message of immigrant communities across in mainstream American media, maybe for authorship of op-eds or something.
We've really been late, but I know you've all had your hand up for a long time. If you can go with a quick question, and you'll have the last one.
Okay, well, I was just wondering in particular, especially considering issues about isolation and how physical mobility can translate to independence and empowerment. Started to talk about with your question over there, but what do you think the city should do to help facilitate better mobility for everyone, but in particular seniors?
Well, I think we need to fix paratransit first and foremost. Sometimes it works, but many times seniors wait, or people in general wait too long, to get the ride that they need to get. I think absolutely subways need to be much more accessible. We had a delegation from Spain to meet with us, and particularly was somebody who's involved in the government in Barcelona. 100% of the stations in the subway in Barcelona are accessible. 100%. They just couldn't wrap their mind around our lack of accessibility. I think also there's a senior problem, and I think it's a handicap problem. People live in a 4th floor walk-up in places that have no elevators, and they're virtually trapped in their apartment. If they can come down once a day, it's a lot. So that's a serious problem, and it's a matter of, really taking a census of people who are in that situation and figuring out how can we get them to either the ground floor or places that are more user-friendly and vacate those apartments for people who can climb the four floors. I think in general, our transportation, as good as it is, does not really take into consideration people who are handicapped. And that's the best way I can put it. And I think we have to make a greater effort because isolation is a consequence of the lack of accessibility in many places, not because a person doesn't want to be involved.
Well, with that, I think we can end this, and I just want to thank everybody for coming. I want to say quickly in response to Arlene's really great question right before the end there, that we've just kind of begun this conversation. This is going to be such an important issue for New York going forward. I think it's one of the reasons we wanted to put this forward and have this panel discussion today. I think also, I wanted to say that the Center for an Urban Future, I think it's important. We're not an advocate for elderly New Yorkers. We're not an advocate for immigrants. But we see this as such a critical issue for New York. And that's why we were putting these points out there today. And I think that going forward, we're going to continue to try to do more research and have these kind of conversations. We also really believe that everybody here has to put this in front of their policymakers, their legislators. And this is a great opportunity with the change of administration to really make sure that these are seen as critical issues for the city going forward. So anyway, thank you. Please join me in